Let me come to the first talk of this session. It's a pleasure to introduce Irene Giardina, who is a professor at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, where she also obtained a PhD working with Giorgio Parisi. She'll speak about the statistical physics of bird flocks and swarms, work that she has pursued for well over a decade, along with Andrea Cavagna, as well as Giorgio Parisi and Nicola Cabibbo, among others in the early days. I recall a lunch conversation with Irene and Andrea in Rome when they were still setting up the observational part of this work about the challenges in obtaining reliable observational data. The conversation ended with a tongue-in-cheek suggestion from me because I had better ideas, and with Andrea protesting that when people finally understood the challenges, they began to make jokes instead of making questions. The work has come a long way since then, and it has been very well acknowledged, including the Max Delbrück Prize for Biological Physics of the APS. And Irene will now tell us about this exciting story. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you very much, Sri, for this nice introduction. Actually, I want to go back to what you said, namely, now we have been studying these systems for a long time, but as you were telling, I was born as a statistical physics, and I did my PhD on spin glasses with Giorgio. So, I mean, I spent part of my career studying spin glasses and glasses systems. So everything related to living groups for me started in 2004. When I was in Rome, back in Rome after a few years of postdocs abroad. And I was still working on spin glasses, collaborating with Giorgio. And at some point, there was this weird project. It was a network project involving several institutes in Europe, coordinated by Giorgio, and the topic of this project was flocking, right? So there were biologists, there were physicists who had been developing models of collective motion for some time, and even economists who wanted to see whether this kind of approach could be used also in economics. And then our idea at the time was to start taking data, which was something not really available at the time. And why taking data? Because in Rome, there are a lot of starling flocks, and there are many roosting sites for them. So during the winter, there is a huge activity in flocking. And actually, we were very naive at the time. We thought the problem would have been much easier to solve. It was not. So we had a really difficult time to do good experiments and to find results on these systems. But actually, the problem was so fascinating that when that project finished, I and also Andrea decided to continue working on this topic, and we completely left the spin glasses and glasses and have been working on this ever since. We set on our lab, and now it's almost 20 years that we look at these systems. So what I would like to do today is to tell you a little bit what we learned from all these years of research on the behavior of collective, of the behavior of living groups, and in particular flocks and swarms. So, okay. The flocks and swarms are just a few examples of animal groups and groups of living entities. And in this slide, in the top row, I show you a few examples of living groups that we have been studying along these years, starting from the microscopic scale of cells up to the macroscopic scale of insects and birds. So from the perspective of a statistical physicist, what is interesting in these systems is that the collective behavior that we observe is an emergent phenomenon. Namely, it is due to the interaction between individuals. And in this respect, they are similar to what we have been studying for a long time in condensed matter systems. There is another feature which is particularly important and to be taken into account, and it is the fact that these systems are what we call nowadays active systems. So this means that each individual partaking in the group has a mechanism, a sort of internal motor, which allows it to transform energy into motion. Okay, so this makes the system automatically out of equilibrium. So we have these two features which are very important: the presence of interactions between individuals, which give rise to collective behavior, and the presence of activity, of motility, which makes the system out of equilibrium. Now, there is nowadays a branch of condensed matter, which is called active matter, which is dedicated to the study of active systems, both non-living and living. So in this bottom row, I'm showing you a few examples of non-living active matter. So for example, here we have some beautiful experiments which have been done on granular active matter. These are tapped rice grains. These are some experiment of Narayan done in 2007. And this is in the center, this is an experiment of the group of Olivier Dauchot. These again are discs, tapped discs. And on the right, on the other hand, it's Janus particles, which display this collective motion. So when, as a physicist, we look at this behavior and we want to describe it, we use what I summarized in this slide as the physicist approach. So the starting point is that details do not matter. There are few features which are important to explain the large-scale behavior and universality class of the system we are looking at. And because of this, we can introduce simple models, minimal models that are able to explain the large-scale behavior. Now, of course, this kind of approach has been demonstrated to be valid in condensed matter. It has also been deeply investigated in non-living active matters. However, the question of whether it is justified also for animal groups, it's a little bit more subtle. And why is that? The reason is that in living groups, both the individuals themselves and the interactions among them are much more complex than in non-living active matter. And more precisely, it might even be that interaction between individuals are driven not just by mechanical or chemical interactions, but by cognitive interactions, which are therefore a new level of complexity as compared to what we are used to in physics. So, however, I mean, along these years, what we could verify, looking at the data and looking at the model, is that actually this approach works also when we want to describe flocks and swarms. And I will try in the rest of my talk to justify this statement. So the important consequence of this is that actually we can build simple models to describe these systems. We do not need to incorporate all the complicated details of how an individual bird or an individual insect is made or of their complicated interactions. There are just a few ingredients that we need to take into account. The problem is to find out what these ingredients are. Okay, so I will now tell you a little bit what we learned, and in particular, I will focus on two systems, namely flocks of birds and swarms of insects. I will not talk about cell colonies today. Okay, so these are the two systems I will tell you about, and on the left you can see a movie of a starling flock. In this particular case, you also can see a predatory attack. The big guy is a falcon. And but I mean, I'm showing you this movie to tell you something that actually you already know, namely the fact that flocks are ordered system. So they display global directional order. Everybody goes in the same direction. So these systems are ordered, and on top of that, one can see that they also display large-scale correlation functions. And I will tell you a little bit about this later on. The other system that we are be looking at are swarms of insects, and you can see a movie here on the right. And contrary to flocks, swarms are not ordered system from what concerns the directional degrees of freedom. So everybody has a different direction. So the global degree of order in the system, what is called the polarization in the language of active matter, is actually almost zero. However, as I will show you, these systems also display long-range correlations in the directional degrees of freedom. So to conclude, we will be looking at two different kinds of systems, one which is an ordered system, the other one which is a disordered system, but in both cases with strong correlations. Now, what are the important features that we need to take into account when looking at these systems? A few of them I already told you about. There are interactions between individuals, which are the origin of the non-trivial collective patterns, and also of the non-trivial correlations that, as I will tell you, observe in these systems. Then there is activity, the fact that these individuals are motile, and this is a source of out of equilibrium behavior. And these two aspects, let's say, they have been discussed a lot, both theoretically and experimentally. What is what has been less discussed in the literature, and what it turns out to be very important in our systems, is the fact that there are other important slow variables. There are conservation laws that need to be taken into account if we want to describe properly their behavior. And there is another important fact, namely the fact that these systems are finite. The size is finite. Namely, they are large enough for a statistical description to be appropriate, but they are not in the thermodynamic limit. An important consequence of this is that dynamical crossovers acquire a crucial relevance when we want to describe natural groups. From the biological standpoint, of course, there are many questions that one would like to address. What regulates order? What makes cohesion robust? What makes response efficient? And what sets the size limits for group coherence? And we are trying to answer, at least in part, to these interesting questions. So what about modeling? So there has been a lot of activity in modeling collective motion, even before we started to do our first experiments. And the models that you can find in the market are basically of two big classes. So there are models like this one that specify the equation of motion of the individuals in the group. So this one that I wrote here in a very schematic way is one of the most renowned models of collective motion, the Witschek model. And it states that if I am an individual in the group and I have to decide in which direction I have to fly, I just look at my neighbors and try to align my own flight direction to the direction, to the average direction of neighbors. So it is an alignment mechanism, very similar to what happens, to what occurs, for example, in a ferromagnet. However, contrary to ferromagnets, there is a big difference. The neighborhood, namely, what are the individuals I'm interacting with, changes in time. Okay, because individuals move and exchange positions. So, and this is the non-equilibrium character of the story. Another way of dealing theoretically with these kind of systems is to look at coarse-grained models. So I don't look any longer at the individual behavior. I just consider a very large active fluid and look at a small volume where there are many individuals inside, and I just compute the average local density and the local velocity within average velocity within this box. So I just introduce two fields, a density field and a velocity field, and I write down equations for these fields. So this kind of hydrodynamic approach has also been pursued a lot in the past years. So we have been working in both these two contexts, but what I will be doing today is mainly talk about the upper one and not the lower one, which is technically more demanding. Okay, so, but as I was telling you before, our main objective is to start from the data, to build models from the data. So what kind of experiments do we perform? We perform stereoscopic experiments. So what this means is that we use a setup with multiple video cameras shooting in a synchronous manner and at a very high frequency. And we exploit the two-dimensional information coming from each one of these video sequences to build the three-dimensional trajectories of each individual in the group. So here on the right bottom, you can see a simple stereometric setup with two cameras. Actually, to enhance the performance of our system, we use three of them. Okay, this is the analog. The previous one was the setup we use to shoot at flocks. So we are on the top of a roof. And this is the setup that we use to shoot at swarms. So swarms are found in the parks. So we just go in the parks. And since they are smaller and closer, we don't need to put these stereometric cameras very far apart. We can choose smaller distances overall. So what is the main difficulty of this kind of experiments? The main difficulty is due to what we call the blobs. So what are blobs? Here you can see the real movies of two cameras in a real experiment on flocks. And on the right, you can see the 2D trajectories on the two CCDs of the two cameras. And what you can see is that at some point, due to the perspective that we have on the flock, two individuals, two trajectories just coincide. And when they coincide, the two trajectories merge. And actually, we don't know who is who during those times. Therefore, there is a proliferation of potential 2D trajectories. Some of them are correct, some of them are not. And when we must do the tracking, we must do the stereoscopic matching of these trajectories between different cameras, we don't know what is the correct matching. So we need to use basically global optimization algorithms to come out of this conundrum. And so this is just an example of how these optimization algorithms work. But in the end, we developed our algorithms. We took a lot of time to build efficient ones, but we did it. And what comes out from these experiments are the three-dimensional trajectories of the individuals during a collective motion. So here you can see two examples of flocks. In these cases, these are flocks that are turning collectively. And an example of a swarm where you can see the trajectories are much more erratic. So once we have these trajectories, we can start computing things, the standard things that we would compute in a system, for example, of particles or in a ferromagnet. So in particular, one of the first things we have been looking at were correlation functions. So correlation functions of what? So here, this is an example from a flock. This is the two-dimensional projection of the velocity field in these flocks. This is a real flock. This is a real experiment. So these small arrows correspond to the velocities of each individual. And as you can see, everybody is flying more or less in the same direction. Flocks are ordered, as I was telling you before. But from this field, we can build the fluctuation field. We can subtract to each individual velocity the mean group velocity. So we get the field of the fluctuations. And once we have this field, we can see that there are large correlating regions, and we can quantify the extension of these regions by looking at the two-point correlation function. So we consider at the same time, two individuals at distance are in the flock, and we look at how similar their deviations in the velocity, in the flight directions are one with respect to the other. So if we look at this correlation function, we can do this for flocks and we can do this for swarms. This is what we find. So on the top row, there is the case of flocks, and this is the correlation function as a function of distance equal time for one flocking event, okay, at one instant of time. Then we can average over times, but this is just to see how this correlation function looks at a given instant of time. So you can see that this correlation function decays in space, and it has a characteristic length scale that here is called R0. This is the correlation length of our flock. Then what we can do is that we can compute the correlation length in many different flocks. And what we find is that this correlation length scales linearly with the size of the system. This means that there is no intrinsic length scale in the system and correlations are scale free. We can do the same also in swarms, and we find the same behavior. Okay, so in both swarms and flocks, correlations are scale free. Now, these are two different systems. And as I was telling you before, flocks are ordered, and you can see this quantitatively by looking at the polarization, the global degree of alignment for both flocks and swarms. So for flocks, it is very close to 1. For swarms, it fluctuates around 0. So we have an example of an ordered system and a disordered system. In both cases, correlations are scale free. Now, can we interpret, understand, explain this behavior in terms of the minimal models of self-propelled particles that I've been showing you in one of my previous slides, the Witchsec model, for example? The reply to this question is yes, at a qualitative level, at least we can explain this behavior within the Witchsec model. Why? Because the Witchsec model is a model with an alignment interaction. So in the low temperature phase, in the order region, like any model with alignment interaction, there are soft modes, which are the origin of these scale-free correlations that we see in flocks. Okay, so these soft modes are the consequence of the breaking of the rotational symmetry because the system spontaneously orders and breaks the rotational symmetry. And it is known that due to the Goldstone theorem, we have these Goldstone modes that produce large-scale fluctuations. So for flocks, large-scale fluctuations are the consequence of this symmetry breaking. In swarms, we cannot invoke such an argument because swarms are in the disorder phase. So the only explanation for these large-scale fluctuations is that they are in the critical region. So they are not ordered, but they are very close to the ordering transition. So if we want to pictorially represent this kind of situation, we would describe a phase diagram of this kind. This is the polarization as a function of the control parameter of our system. And we find flocks in the order region and swarms in the critical disorder region.
So Irene,
okay. Yes.
From Abhishek, why anti-correlation at large distances?
Okay, so this is uniquely a consequence of how we define the fluctuations. Okay, so in principle, in a model, we would define the fluctuations by subtracting the theoretical mean. Okay, the theoretical velocity mean. But here we cannot do that because we do not know a priori what the theory is. So the only thing that we can do on the data is to subtract the mean velocity of the group. So if you want the sum over I of all the VIs, okay? And this automatically gives this anti-correlation. Okay, so it is a consequence of the it's a finite size effect. It's a consequence of how we define the fluctuations. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So so far we have this nice picture which explain qualitatively what occurs in both systems. And let me also add that if one uses inferences techniques, statistical inference techniques, to understand what are the kind of models that best describe our equal time correlation function, it turns out that these are precisely the alignment models like the Witchsec one that I've been introducing before. Now, something changes when we start looking at the properties that depends not only on space, but also on time.
So one more question from Jorge. What about Galilean invariance?
With respect of what?
Maybe Jorge, you can explain yourself.
Yes. No, I was just wondering if the entire flock decides to fly a bit faster. Do you get an invariance for that, or there is a good relation with respect to the speed of the air on which you're flying? Are there fluctuations in the magnitude of velocity? Not the orientation, but are there sort of fluctuations in the speed, in the actual magnitude of the velocity?
Yes, there are fluctuations in the speed in the case of flux. Okay, so when you look at flux, I didn't mention this because this is a whole chapter by itself. But when you look at flux, you can see that there are even very strong fluctuations in the speed correlations.
That was my question.
Okay.
That was my question.
And we have been working a lot to try to explain to try to understand what kind of model can explain this kind of large scale speed fluctuations. And actually we came out with a model where there is a marginal potential that regulates the speed of the individuals. And we have a work on the archive on that, and who is interested can look at that. This is very interesting because that would imply, from the point of view of statistical physics, that would imply a zero temperature critical point. So if anyone is interested, you can look on the archive. There is a paper on that. Okay. So now I wanted to talk about time-dependent quantities. And the first way we can do this is by looking at collective turns. So here we are looking at flux, which perform these collective turns. You can see the original movie on the left and the reconstruction on the right. So you can see the dynamical reconstruction. You see all these individuals that turn. And on top of that, the turn is almost bidimensional. Flux are three-dimensional groups, but when they turn, they are almost they do this almost on a plane. So when one looks, it looks like they are all synchronously turning, but it's not like that. There is actually a propagation of turning. So there are a few guys that start turning first, and then a few other ones follows, and so on. So here, this is a map that shows precisely this. So the red guys are the ones who turn first, and then all the other ones after that. So there is a propagation phenomenon. There is an information, which is in this kind, a directional information, where do I have to go, that propagates through the group, okay? So one can try to quantify the law governing this information propagation. And this is what we can do, what we do here on the right. Here on the right, each curve corresponds to a different turning event, a different flock. And what is plotted is the position within the flock of the turning front as a function of the time at which those guys are turning. So the important point is that in all these cases, there is a linear regime before boundary effects kick in. So there is a linear propagation. On top of that, we can also check that this propagation is almost undamped. So there is no damping of the directional information. So would the Vic model reproduce this behavior? Okay, to understand this, we can look, which is more intuitive to represent, we can look at the two-dimensional case. In the two-dimensional case, the velocities are represented by an angle, this phi here, okay? And this alignment interaction, if you assume that this angle varies smoothly from individual to individual, can be represented as a Laplacian, okay? And this one-step variation of the velocity can be represented as a first-order derivative. So if you look at this equation, it is clear that the dispersion law given by the Vic model is a dissipative diffusion kind of propagation law, which is not consistent with what we observe in the data. Okay, so something must be changed. So what should we change? So if we try to think a little bit about what can give us a linear dispersion relation, what comes out are second order dynamical equations, wave equations. So the idea would be, what if instead of using the first order derivative here, we use a second order derivative? From a biological point of view, that would mean that each individual is not able to abruptly update its flight direction when some external forces acts upon it. So there is an inertia in doing that, which is very realistic from the biological point of view. So if we substitute the first order derivative with the second one, what we get is a linear dispersion law as expected, but on top of that, we get also a very quantitative prediction of what should be the slope of the lines I was showing you before. Therefore, the speed of propagation, okay? And this is the prediction. This is a prediction that we can check on the data. Okay, so we check this on the data and the prediction is very well obeyed. And this really suggests that we need to take into account this inertia to change, this behavioral inertia to change direction, which implies a second order derivative. Now, adding a second order derivative, it is related actually to a conservation law, because what one can see is that if we define the first order derivative as a new variable that I've called here S, this S is nothing else than the generator of the rotational symmetry of the velocities. So there is a symmetry which we need to incorporate in the model to get this second order derivative and to get the correct dispersion law. Good. Clearly, this is an extreme simplification of what is realistically the correct equation for these individuals. And we need to expect that there is also some dissipation. So there would be also contribution of a first order derivative. So if we put everything together, what we would get is this kind of model that we call the inertial spin model. And this model can be described both in terms of this generator S of the symmetry or directly as an equation for the velocity. And what you can see is that it incorporates all the ingredients we think are relevant to describe this system. So we have dissipation, we have the noise, we have the activity, which is here inside, and the alignment. And then we have this new parameter, this behavioral inertia, which comes out with the second order derivative. Also notice that if we take the overdamped limit of this model and we just cancel these first two terms, we get the Witzek model. So this is just an underdamped generalization of the Witzek model. And the new parameter appearing in the equation is this behavioral inertia. Okay, so this is very important to reproduce the dynamical properties of flock. And also, if you simulate this model with all the ingredients, we can see that it is actually true. So, for example, here on the left, you can see the overdamp limit of the previous model, which coincides with the Witzek model. And this is a numerical experiment where at some point we turn by hand an individual and we check whether the other ones follow. So you can see that the other ones do not follow. There is a distortion of the directional information here, but the group is not able to turn collectively. On the other hand, if we look at the model in the underdamped phase, where the second order derivative and inertia dominates, the group is able to perform a collective turn, okay? Anyway, of course, since these models has both the ingredients, inertia and dissipation, there will be a crossover between the underdamped behavior and the overdamped behavior. And this crossover is regulated by how strong is dissipation as compared to inertia with respect to the size of the system. So it is possible to define a critical size such that smaller groups behave in an underdamped manner and can turn coherently, and larger groups don't, okay? So the bottom line of this analysis of flux is that we need to take into account inertia. What I've not been mentioning to you is that actually the other ingredient that is a priori important in describing this system, namely the fact that they are active and they can move one with respect to the other, it doesn't seem to be so relevant to describe flux. And why is that? Because, for example, when you look at a turn, you can see that all individuals keep their mutual position. They want to turn in a coherent way. They don't exchange position while they are doing that. So activity is there. It probably does something, but it is not crucial to explain what we observe from a dynamical standpoint. Now let's go to the case of swarms. And let's check whether what we saw, what we understood by looking at flocks also holds in swarms. So these are experiments performed on swarms. And here you can see the real experiment and the 3D reconstruction. And since for swarms, we have longer trajectories because the swarm does not move, so it remains in the field of view of our 3 cameras for a long time, we can compute not just equal time correlation functions, but also space-time correlation functions. We have enough data to do that, long enough data to do that. So what do? We generalize the correlation function that I introduced in one of my previous slides by looking not just at 2 different positions in the group, but also at 2 different times. So what we are asking now is how a certain individual in a certain position of the group at a certain time is correlated in terms of flight directions with another individual at another position at a later time. So this is the space-time correlation function, and it is defined in this way. Of course, for t equals 0, this is nothing else than the correlation function I've been talking to you before. So it is convenient to look at the data for practical reason, not to look at this correlation function in space, but Fourier transform it and look it as a function of the wave vector k and time. This is the definition, and this is what we have been computing on data. So here on the left, you can see for a single swarm, okay, the correlation function at several different values of k, at different scales, spatial scales, okay? And we can see that the correlation time depends on the scale k, okay? The different, if you look at how the system decorrelates at larger scales, it takes a larger time. So I could also have done something different. I could have looked at correlation functions at a fixed value of k in different swarms. I would have found a very similar plot. So the question is now, can we describe in a unified way the behavior of this correlation function? In physics, we know that we can do that because there is a very strong hypothesis that has been actually verified using RG and using other techniques in physical systems, which is the dynamic scaling hypothesis. What is this hypothesis about? The dynamic scaling hypothesis relies on 2 assumptions. The first is that the external control parameters that regulate the behavior of our system only enters in the correlation function through the correlation length. This is the first assumption. The second assumption is that larger regions decorrelate on larger times, and there is a relationship between the decorrelation time and the scale at which I'm looking at. And this relation is regulated by an exponent, which is called the dynamic critical exponent, this Z here. So if we assume these 2 things, what happens is that if we express all distances in units of the correlation length and all times units of the decorrelation time, we can make all the correlation functions collapse one on top of the other. In particular, if we look at this C hat correlation function, which is the correlation function divided by the static correlation function, the one computed at t equals 0, this would be, according to this dynamic scaling hypothesis, a function of t over the characteristic time and the product of k and psi, so that if we fix k psi, the time dependence of this reduced correlation function only occurs through this rescaling quantity here, t multiplied k to the z. So if we plot our correlation function not in terms of t, but in terms of this quantity here, they should collapse one on top of the other. So we checked this on our data. So these are correlation functions of different swarms, but since we want to fix the product k psi, for each of these different swarms, we chose k equal 1 over xi, where xi is the correlation length as measured in that swarm, okay? So these are this correlation function for different swarms plotted as a function of time. They decorrelate in different ways. However, now we try to plot them not as a function of t, but as a function of this variable here. And we check whether for some values of z, we get a collapse. And the answer is yes, we get a collapse, and we get a collapse for a value of z, which is of order 1. And again, if we try to directly check this relationship here, what we find is that actually the correlation time is related to k through an exponent, which is again of the order of 1. To be more precise, this exponent is around 1.2, okay? So this is the same analysis performed for a VHSEC numerical simulation, and we get a collapse, but the exponent is different. So the bottom line of this data analysis and comparison with models is that once again, even though the VHSEC model was appropriately describing the static equal time quantities, when we go and look at time-dependent quantities, it is not appropriate any longer. We should add something. So of course, it naturally comes to mind that since we understood in flux that inertia plays a crucial role, it might be that also in this case, inertia play a crucial role. And actually this is confirmed if we look at the shape of the correlation functions, okay? So the shape of the correlation function has a flat derivative at small times, which is a feature that one would not find in a dissipative kind of model like the VHSEC one. Okay, and this can be quantified by looking at how this derivative behaves in all our swarming events. So the guess is that we need to include inertia to reproduce this exponent. And let me mention that having a dynamic critical exponent, which is so small, is not trivial at all. So here I am just writing down the dynamic critical exponent for well-known models that have been studied in the literature. The first two are equilibrium models, okay? And then we have the VHSEC model in the order phase, in the disorder phase, within a incompressible theory, and so on. So in all these cases, the exponent is much larger than the 1.2 that we find in experiments. So we need to come out with a novel theory. And from what I've been telling you before, this novel theory must include inertia, okay? So, so far, what we understood is that in both flux and swarms, inertia and the fact of having this second derivative, namely a conservative part in the dynamics of the individuals, is an important feature to take into account. Now, I've been telling you that in the case of flux, actually the motility of individuals is not so important. Is it the same for swarms? So the reply to this is no. And we can see this in the data, but there is also a theoretical argument that we can make about that. In this slide, I will show you part of this theoretical argument. And what you see here are numerical simulations for a model which is of the VHSEC class. And what I plot here is the entropy production rate. So the entropy production rate is a quantity that is related to the degree of out of equilibrium of the system. What you can see for this plot is that so this is the polarization as a function of the control parameter for this model. So just focus on one of these curves, for example, this one. So this is the order phase, and this is the disorder phase, and the transition is around here. And this is the corresponding plot for the entropy production rate. What you can see is the entropy production rate that peaks around the transition. So this means that in the critical region, we have a large contribution of the out of equilibrium features of our system. So if you remember the behavior of swarms of insects, I've been telling you that these systems are quasi-critical. They are disordered, but they are very close to the ordering transition. So this analysis is telling us, look, be careful, because these systems, since they are in the critical region, they are precisely in that region where out of equilibrium effects, namely activity and motility, is the most relevant. Okay, so we need to, if you want to reproduce the behavior that we find in the data, we really need to take into account the role of activity. So to conclude this part, what we need to, what we understood is that if we want to reproduce this dynamic critical exponent, we need to develop a theory which includes inertia and includes activity. So, and we have been working of this kind of theory using the hydrodynamic approach for some time, and we have some papers out now which show how it is possible to do that. And if any of you is interested, please look at the archive where these papers are posted. So I will conclude. My time is finished, so I will conclude. And my conclusion is that I've been trying to show you that, first of all, in general terms, statistical physics is crucial to understand what are the collective properties of these systems. The main message of my talk is that when looking at natural groups, which are finite in size, we need to be careful to include all those ingredients that on finite scales, which are the ones relevant for what we observe, are able to produce the dynamical behavior that we observe. In the case of both flocks and swarms, these ingredients include, of course, interactions, and this was known, of course, activity, but also behavioral inertia and the presence of conservative mechanisms in the dynamics. Okay, so this is all. So I'd like to thank you, and this is our group and our collaborators. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Irene, for finishing well on time. So there are a couple of questions in the chat box, but let me just call out people in order, and you can ask the question yourself. So Prashant Singh, has your question been answered? Which was the scaling, whether the scaling behavior is different in swarms and flocks. Do you need any elaboration?
I sort of explained that we understood the scaling behavior in terms of different mechanisms. So in one case, it is this spontaneous symmetry breaking. In the other case, it's a critical effect. Okay.
So the next is Vishnu. Vishnu, do you want to ask? While we're waiting for that, let me just read it out. He asks, since there is a crossover in the behavior of flocks in the model with changing parameters, can measurements of real flock size distributions be used to infer the natural values of the parameters of the model?
Okay, actually, to do that, we would need to infer the macroscopic parameters of this model, the ISM model, the ones which includes also inertia. We are working on that. So the problem is not easy because statistical inference for second order equations is much more complex than for first order equation. Even for the stochastic harmonic oscillator. So, and the point is that the crucial point is that this system is Markovian in terms of the two variables, position and velocity. But what you really observe from the experiments are just positions. So once you write down your stochastic model only in terms of the observed degrees of freedom, which are the positions, then the dynamics becomes non-Markovian and the inference is much more complex. So this is the reason. We have a paper on the archive on PRX where we address the problem of statistical inference for second order equations. So we addressed the theoretical part, and now we need to transform our theoretical understanding in a good way to be applied to the data. So this is in one of our objectives, but we haven't still done that.
Okay, so the next question is Wendong Wong. If you want to ask, please unmute yourself and go ahead. If not, I'll read it out. He says, thanks for the wonderful talk. How to define the probability of inverse trajectory in the definition of entropy production rate?
Okay, so actually this is unpublished work, so I will not I will not reveal, but it should be out soon, and you will be able to see that in the data. Okay.
Okay, I think the next question was Smarajit. You can, yeah, no, you have to unmute yourself. You cannot?
Okay, now I was allowed.
I've done it, Srikanth, yeah.
Organizers are also not. Anyway, yeah, thanks, Irene. This is a very nice talk. And so recent days, I started looking at some of the active matter business. So what I generally encountered is that there is a long range velocity correlation that seems to be setting up in this kind of systems. Mm-hmm. And but probably, hopefully also will be true even this in these flocks. So is there some way to understand it? The origin of such a long range velocity correlation?
You mean the speed or the of the flight direction velocity correlation?
Yeah, I think both the magnitude and the direction, if you take it, let's say the vector product in some sense.
Okay, so the long range correlation in the flight directions, they are basically due to the fact that we are dealing with a system where we have a spontaneous order. Okay, so the system basically orders in a given direction, but the fluctuations around that given direction are soft. And that's just a consequence of the breaking of the symmetry that you get, for example, in the Heisenberg model. That's exactly the same origin. Okay.
But what about in the swarms, where you do not have this alignment interaction? But even then, like we looked at some of the active glass models, which recently Chandan and Madan, these people worked on. And there are many other active glass model, like for coarsening dynamics. It seems to be that the velocities are correlated over a very long distance, even though there is no alignment interaction as part. Just
I don't know. It might be that there is. I don't know these systems you're talking about, but the answer is I don't know. But it might be that there is an effective alignment between the individuals. So, for example, I was showing in one of my first slides that some experiments, okay, the experiments of the group of Olivier Dochot, where you have these disks. So there, it's not that you have an alignment in the microscopic setup, but it's just that these disks at some point, since they are tough, they keep bouncing on each other, and this makes up an effective alignment. So it might be that there is something in these models you are describing, in the system that we are describing, that makes up, even on a microscopic scale, an effective alignment. But I don't know, because I'm not sure. I don't know precisely the system you're talking about.
But in the swarm case that you looked at, do you see such behavior? The swarms do not have alignment, but in that, did you look at?
No, they have alignment. Our idea is that they have alignment.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So we think at swarms as systems where there is alignment, but we are not in the region of the parameters where the systems is ordered. Okay. But there is alignment. Precisely, I mean, since we find this strong correlation in the directional degrees of freedom, we think that there is alignment having a role in the system.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yeah, so there are a couple more questions. Vincent Saxtetter, do you want to ask your question yourself? You're unmuted.
Sure. Hey, Irene.
Hi, Vincent.
I've actually been jealous of you ever since I first saw you taking that data in 2004, 2005. I felt like I completely, you took it, you know, people just take two different paths, and I've always been jealous of that path. It was a beautiful direction, and you've done very important work, a very important system. But I wanted to ask you, and maybe this is something we could talk about more later, but I am really interested in anything you might have learned about what happens to a flock or a swarm as it goes through a phase transition. Either it it divides into two, or it disperses, or it comes together, and what is the time evolution of a flock or a swarm as it does that sort of thing? Like, because I'm interested in what happens to systems when they collapse, or they build, or they things like that.
Okay, so actually, in the case of flocks, experimentally, we sort of cannot answer to that question, because we always see flocks well cohesive and coherent. Okay, actually, this is not even true. In some cases, when you have predatory attacks, you can see the flocks dividing and then coming back together. Okay. However, unfortunately, we don't have good data on those events, because typically they are very far away from us, and they involve very large flocks, and we are not able to perform the stereometric reconstruction. Okay. Something similar, which is maybe more at hand, happens also in swarms when they are perturbed. So we tried some perturbations on swarms, just some pilot experiments. And in some cases, we saw that the swarm just divides and then comes back together. So these are certainly very interesting features that it should be interesting to look at in the future. But we haven't done anything so far quantitative, so we don't have any specific understanding on this.
With a swarm, you might maybe adjust its conditions so it doesn't want to be a swarm anymore, and maybe heat it up or something, and watch how it decides to disperse.
Yeah, you can perturb it. So we are thinking about different kind of perturbations, and I guess we will hopefully soon, because COVID is a very strong constraint on that, but resume experiments.
Okay.
Irene, there are two more questions that I would like you to take before we close. And then Abhishek.
I hope I am unmuted. So thanks, Irene, for a fantastic talk. It's wonderful to see this. I was not aware of this latest thing that you have on entropy production and time reversal.
Yeah.
So just a quick question, because I worked on this some time ago. Can you separate out the effect in time reversal somehow in the time reversal of position and the entropy production that you have on that, and then a kind of conditional time reversal of the velocity and the entropy production of that part? It does give some results for the underdamped Langevin equation. Yeah, it's just to say that I thought that was fascinating. I have to follow it up.
Okay, so maybe I will send you we are writing down this thing. I will send you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Abhishek, go ahead. There is actually one more question after that, if we can squeeze that in.
Yeah, actually, my question was very similar. I mean, on this entropy production. So, because you said it's a kind of local entropy in this case, right? So, you mean local in space, right?
So, what you are referring to? In my slide, I said something like this.
You said that the entropy production rate is kind of local, like it's higher in some regions, and so you had,
so what I showed in the slide. So I'm not on sharing any longer, so I cannot show you the slide. But what I've been showing is that it peaks around the transition. So if you just tune the control parameter of your system, okay, it peaks it is larger in the region where you have the ordering transition.
Okay, but you didn't say anything about, like, there's a special distribution of the entropy production, like it's more entropy production in some regions and lower in some.
Okay, so we have results on that, but I didn't tell anything about that, because but we have results on that, and we can talk about that later. Okay. Thanks. So it's different from MIPS. So these are polar models, and it's different from MIPS. So I think this is a very interesting point. So this is a very interesting, I think, results. So I'll send the paper to everyone as soon as it is out. We're just writing it down.
Thanks.
Irene, one last question, quick answer. Can a swarm become a flock and vice versa?
Okay, we never actually saw anything of the kind in the data. But this is, so, I mean, just consider my reply with care, okay? So this is just anecdotal in the sense that for some events that we have been shooting at some point, you can really see the swarm which start rotating temporarily, okay? So you have this swarm, at some point you see that it really starts to display collective rotation, a collective rotation. And then it stops rotating and it becomes erratic again. This is the closest thing I've seen to a collective directional ordering, a rotation in this case for swarms.
But on the other hand, nothing's stopping that from happening, I guess, in terms of what you understand.
Not from the physical point of view, from the biological, yes. Okay. And namely the fact that I think they don't want to get ordered, because if they get ordered, they would move, and they don't want to move. They want to remain close to where the swarm has been formed, which is close to where female lays the eggs. So swarms are made by males, and they form these swarms for reproductive reasons, because they want the female to go there and pair with them. So the swarm doesn't want to move. They want to remain there because they know that the females are there somewhere. Okay, so there is a biological reason which probably, but I don't know why, causes this organizing mechanisms such that the control parameter always remains such that for that size, the swarm has very strong correlations, but not order.
Okay, great. Thank you, Irene. We have to leave it at that. Thanks for a wonderful talk.